Hey guys, Broken Stars here. Today I'm going to be talking about how to play against various RFIs. So my last video I kind of went through, what type of ranges you want to be opening with typically at a 6 max no limit hold'em game. And now I'm going to try to go through basically like what ranges you might want to play after someone raises. So the first spot I'm going to be going over is we'll be talking about when under the gun opens. So in my last video, I said an under the gun RFI range is around like say 16 to 18%. So it looks something like this. And if you think about the game, you would first say like, well, in MP, you got four other people behind you. Um, so you would be tighter in the MP than you would be in the cutoff. Because if it let's say you're in the cutoff, under the gun opens, MP folds, you get to the cutoff. There's only three people behind. So actually, let me write this down. So if U2G opens and we want to think about how we want to play versus that open, then we can say some like really basic stuff. We'll be tighter in MP than we will in cutoff, than we will in button. And then small blind's a little bit different. So small blind might be comparable to how we play uh, in MP because we're out of position there. Um, and let me think. So I would say like another thing like you want to think about is if you're playing a three better fold strategy, if you just like three better fold out of the middle position, for instance, like a lot of people will these days will just three better fold essentially, um, which just means under the gun opens and you're in MP, you don't have a calling range, like you just raise or fold. Now, if you played that strategy, at the very least you would be tighter than the under the gun range because well you have five people left to act if you raise then, and I mean it doesn't make sense to be wider than this. So at the very least, you would be tighter than this. Um, so like, let's just try to think about this intellectually. Like you would remove, let's say the bottom portions of things. So like you could just do something like this. Maybe remove these things, remove these. So you could just remove kind of like the bottom portion of stuff. And that would give you, what is this, like a 7% range. Um, and that ends up actually being like really close to what is viable or like what's good. It's like something kind of close to this. And then in the cutoff, you might add in. So let's say MP folds, you might be like very slightly wider than this. So maybe you just add in a little bit, and then in the button, typically people have a flatting range actually on the button. Maybe you start mixing a lot of, like, let's say you add some of these other hands, like these other pocket pairs, but then let's say you just add some of these as calls. So they end up being kind of close. And then you go, something closer to this. And then you go back to the small blind, and then you go back to closer to like what you were doing in the MP. And then the big blind's kind of like a whole different separate thing that I think I'm going to make a different video about, and I'm just going to supply like preflop charts for that basically. So this is only specifically for like how you're playing an MP cutoff button small blind. And typically what I do is I just play a three better fold strategy, and the reason I do that is because it's very simple to play. Um, and that's basically the only reason. So you could have a flatting range, but uh, people actually don't do it very often these days. And I mean, if you don't know anything about poker, you might as well just find someone that you know is better than you and kind of like emulate them. And that's kind of like what I did when I first started. So if we go to some of the ranges I have, like this would be like a GTO like MP range versus UTG, which ends up being around 8%. It's basically like it's like really close, like top 40% of the under the gun RFI range. And like this range actually mixes in folds with tens even, which I think is like quite tight. Like definitely quite tight. And it also like the solution to this spot has like under the gun four betting like over 20% of the time after MP3 bets, which basically doesn't happen in real life. So your equity realization in this spot is typically a lot higher. What I mean is, like, let's say you did three bet a hand like, these suited connectors or these weak pairs, and you ended up getting four bet. You're in a really tough spot. But in reality, people don't four bet that much, and they actually overcall. So you're a lot better off just being a little bit wider and a little bit more linear. So typically, my range is gonna look closer to like I don't really mix these hands. It's gonna be a little bit more linear and probably look something more like this. And maybe I do sevens very occasionally, but pretty rare. And this is just a little bit wider than, pseudo GTO. Might actually mix these hands too. But this is just easier to play. And like you don't have to think about it too hard. And then when you get to the cutoff, maybe you do it just a little bit more. Maybe you add in king queen off. Maybe you up some of these hands. But typically it's really similar to this. And then in the button it doesn't change that much. Um, and you can develop more of a flatting range. So like this would be like a button flatting range where like pretty much everything is mixed. The only pure three bets are basically kings, aces, and ace king. And this would be like the three bet range. So hands that are like zero EV between three bet, flat, and fold are sixes and lower essentially, and like some of these suited connectors and maybe suited one gappers could be close depending on the rake structure and whatnot. Um, and like the situations where you might want to be flatting a little bit more than three betting would be basically when there's fish in the blinds. So if there's weak players in the blinds, you're going to be getting squeezed or like three bet a lot less, and your equity realization is going to go up, and then you get to be playing three-way hands with weak players, which is always really nice. So that's specifically versus UTG, and I was going to actually compare with Poker Snowy again, and I actually haven't even looked at this, so I wanted to see what Poker Snowy does. I know they flat some, and like the range that you maybe would flat would be, like the middling pocket pairs and whatnot. So I think yellow means mixed with flatting, and like that makes a lot of sense. And like Snowy is just a little bit tighter than I like would like typically, but I think it's still good to look at for like beginners. Being a little bit tight is gonna be good. Um, so like with this range, it's pretty close to the one that I was suggesting, but it definitely overvalues like the suited aces like way more than I would recommend. Um, and I don't know why that is. Maybe it's because it gets four bet like a lot less, or Snowy folds a lot more. I think Snowy actually does fold quite a bit. The three bets in this situation and doesn't four bet as much, but it's still similar. And you see that it's valuing more the like what is this 7-6 suited, 6-5 suited, 5-4 suited over these other middling suited connectors, and that's just because there's some like range asymmetry between these hands and these hands. So if you think about like if you were to three bet Jack 10 suited, well actually yeah, let's say Jack 10 suited, and under the gun has to defend. You should actually look at this too. So I might exit out of this, facing a three bet after my raise. Like you might be defending like King Jack suited, Queen Jack suited, and those are just like very easily dominated. Whereas like the 6-5 suited when under the gun defends, I mean, there is no, like, he's not going to have a better six, for instance. So, like, you don't own yourself as much. So, like, let's say you did this, an MP3 bets, which is what we're kind of looking at. So, and yeah, it's way tighter actually. What the hell? It's pure folding king jack suited, which is uh, probably not great. This is definitely like folding like over 70% of the time, which is, again, is probably why the solution values the wheel aces in this situation. But like, for instance, if you three bet like well, like 10-9 suited, it's just dominated way too much. Like there's some overlap with the ranges, and that's why the those hands are typically three bet more than a hand like 9-8 suited. So like moving on, like something like you can say is like, let's take the RFI range and then basically take like the top 40% of that. So for instance, I think I was having MP three bet like 8 or 9, like 8.5% or something. With the RFI being 17.6%. If you just take like the top 40% of that, it's like 7% of hands. If you did that for like every spot, like that's probably fine. And then you could maybe add in a little bit for like every other position. So for instance, let's go to MP. So for MP, this is the RFI I was showing in my other video, which is like 21.5%. Like top 40 to 45% of this, if you're in the cutoff, for instance, would be, let's say, like 9 or 10% of hands, which ends up being like pretty much what you should be doing. So let's say you were in the cutoff, you can start three betting some of this stuff, and it'll end up being like, you know 9-10% of hands. So like, actually, let me get those out. So like, I would three bet like most of these hands, and then hands that are like close. Oops, do this, and then hands that are close might be something like these hands are actually all kind of close. And these hands are still kind of close in my opinion. So like everything that I have 100%, I would just pure three bet. Well, I guess ace jack is kind of still close, but everything 100% I would like pure three bet, and then things that is 50% I would either mix in or and like you could do more of the 7-6, 6-5, 5-4 is typically what I do. I wouldn't do it at like the 50% frequency. I'm just saying like it's just to show like these hands are like closer, should be mixed at equilibrium. And basically if they were under four betting, over calling, over folding, any of those things, then you would mix these in more. Or if like the people behind you were like never four betting either, which is like something you also have to keep in mind. So like for the instance where, well, let's think about like a hypothetical situation. Let's go back to the under the gun example. So if under the gun is opening something like this, if you just pretended that all the other positions didn't exist and you were just in position under the gun, like you would just raise the same range, and then he's screwed, right? I mean, the thing that makes you want to be tighter is simply because there's other players left to act. And one of the things that the other players can do is, I mean, they can four bet you, which is disaster. So like, yeah, let's say someone was four betting, something like this. It ends up being like 4%, and maybe like, yeah, like 4%. If you're an MP and like, let's say only people are four betting the top 4% of hands, that means for each person there's a 96% chance that they don't four bet. So under the gun opens, you're an MP, you three bet, then there's a 4% chance cutoff four bets you. This is just hypothetically. And then uh, another 4% chance that the button four bets you, and then another 4% chance that the small blind 4 bets you, and then another 4% chance that the big blind 4 bets you, and then in this situation, let's presumably say 4% chance that the under the gun 4 bets you, but it's supposed to be quite a bit more. But basically, what this means is about 20% of the time you're going to get 4 bet, which is like, that's like a big reason why you can't go too wide because you're getting 4 bet like at least 20% of the time. Um, I guess I didn't explain the math, but I mean, hopefully that makes sense. So like going back to the other situation, so versus the NPRFI, I mean a 3 bet range with like 9%, so just like top 40, 45% of this RFI range is like good. So if we go to MP, there's MP cutoff 3 bet here. Yeah, this is 9.7%. So it's like 1.5% more than under the gun, and still like a lot of these hands are mixed. So like tens plus are pure, ace jack king queen mixed, like these weak suited 10x hands are mixed, and then a lot of these pocket pairs and like suited connectors and suited aces are mixed. All those hands are kind of whatever in theory, but the less that you're getting 4 bet, the more value that they hold. And typically I would be wider than this, so I would mostly just pure like eights plus, pure ace five, ace four, and then these other hands are kind of close. Like queen 10 I might still mix. Like all these other hands are I view as kind of whatever, like zero EV, at least in my games. I don't really do fives ever, but something like this is very reasonable, and it's very difficult to play against as the out of position player, and it's very easy for you to implement. So like you're forcing a situation on the player that's raising to basically like he has to 4 bet you or he's like just hemorrhaging EV. And this is actually what happens in game. Like people hemorrhage EV in these situations. Like they just don't 4 bet you enough, and then they end up calling actually a bit too much. So your equity realization is like very high, and you get to play more hands than you would otherwise be able to. So let's take a look at what Snowy does. So start this up again. Facing a raise. We want to face. Oops, I messed this up. What is my position? Cut off, and then who raises MP. So view pre-flop advice. And again, this is like quite close to what I was like suggesting, but I still think Snowy is like way overvaluing these suited aces. And I think that's just because the other guy is folding too much and yeah, 4 betting a decent amount. But you still see this asymmetry like with these lower suited hands that comes up a lot in a lot of different situations, not just in this like 3 bet situation, but the range asymmetry with these hands versus the overlap is good in these spots. So yeah, you take like basically top 40 to 50%, and like that's kind of what you should be 3 betting. So for instance, if you're in the button facing a cutoff RFI, which is around 28%, you could say that you could 3 bet, around 14% of hands, which is ends up being like what you should actually do. So let's take a look at like what 14% would look like. So 14, ace 10 is kind of close. But like you could do something like this. And then hands that are like whatever that I wouldn't really pure do would be like some of this stuff. I don't really do these hands, but yeah, like some of these hands I don't really ever 3 bet, but they're still kind of close or on the close end. So like everything that's like 100% will just like mostly be pure 3 betting, and then everything that's like 50% is like close, And what happens in theory is this is like a 12% 3 bet which is similar to the range I just showed, just it's not doing a lot of these hands pure. So even like ace 10's mixed, king jack, queen jack, and down to fives is mixed. Suit connectors all mixed, all the aces mixed, the 9x suited hands are mixed. But then it typically has a flatting range, not that. That is a misclick. I actually don't even have the flatting range here, but it would basically be the inverse of this. Where's the inverse button? Oh, oops. Non-zero hands. It would be the inverse of that, basically, so it would look something like this. Or, something relatively similar. And then the one thing I haven't talked about yet is the small blind. So the small blind range is like a little bit different because you're out of position to the RFI. Um, but it's still similar in the sense that like you don't have to go through as many people. So like in MP versus UTG, you're guaranteed position on the under the gun player if he ends up calling. But in the small blind, you don't have as many people to go through. So that situation where I was, doing some math and saying in the MP after you threw that you're going to get four bet at least 20% of the time, because of everyone behind. When you're in the small blind, there's only two people behind in this hypothetical situation. There's the raiser and then the big blind. So what ends up happening is it's like it's not as wide and it's like more linear. So take the under the gun example, and we said a good three bet versus this is like 9%, top 40-50% of hands. And what ends up happening against this, at least at equilibrium, is the small blind's like just slightly tighter than MP. Or actually, it's like the same. So here's MP, it's like 7.8%, and then here's small blind. So like the difference is like pretty negligible. Just like click between these two. Small blind's just a little bit more linear, which typically is what's going to happen out of position. But I mean, it's not a big difference. Um, but you're way tighter than you would be on the button, for instance. So like ace queen off is mixed in theory as the small blind player versus 17.6% RFI from UTG. And if we look at, like, let's say versus cutoff RFI, this is 11%. So like 28% of hands RFI for the cutoff, and then you take, top 40% of that, ends up being, close to this. And if we applied the same logic for a button RFI, so button RFI being, 40%, you'd say, maybe like 16% of hands for a small blind three bet, and it ends up being about 15%. So this is like a small blind three better fold strategy range for 41% RFI from the button. And let's take a look at what Poker Snowy recommends. I haven't looked at this. Let me open this up again. This is just to provide different, additional context. So let's say you faced a raise, you're in the small blind versus under the gun. It's similar. Again, it's really valuing these like wheel aces like a lot more than it should, to be honest. So this is like close to what I was showing. Let's take a look at small blind versus button. Yeah, it's pretty close. It's like 5 plus most of the aces. You're gonna so like ace 5, ace 4 is better than ace 3, ace 2 typically, and then ace 7, ace 6. Like that's why you see me remove these types of hands first. And like the 9x suited hands, typically I'm three betting these, but it's relatively close. So like if you look at that, and then let me make this smaller. Just pull this up. Can I put it next to it? No, I can't. I have to make this window smaller, I guess. But like you compare these two, like they're still pretty similar. So like this is a pretty good web app for people that are just beginning. I just wouldn't pay attention to the big blind stuff. So the big blind is like a huge function of the sizing that's used as the RFI, which is kind of why I want to make a separate video about it. But yeah, I mean, hopefully that makes sense. So like typically I would recommend just the three better fold strategy out of like MP and cutoff. You can have a flatting range on the button. I mean, you can have a flatting range in the other spots too, but it's just a little less easy to implement because you're playing like you're bifurcating your ranges. So you have a flatting range and you have a three bet range, and then you're more subject to squeezes basically. It's just a little bit harder to play. But the situations where you might want to develop more of a flatting range would be maybe there's shorter stacks behind you. So like you have a wide variety of stack sizes. Not everyone's just 100 big blinds effective. You know, if a guy is 30 big blinds on the button and you have like pocket nines or tens or something, or like ace 10 suited or like ace jack suited or king queen suited, these types of hands are like kind of like in an awkward spot if you end up three betting and the other guy jams. Like it's not a great spot. So in those spots, you could probably develop more of a flatting range, and then the other situation that you might want to develop more of a flatting range is specifically when there's weaker players in the blinds. So flatting suited connectors or like your weak suited aces that they're not that strong to begin with. So like ace seven, ace six, ace three, ace deuce, like ace eight, ace nine, ace queen off. Some of these middling pocket pairs, like these hands can flop very strong hands and play well multi-way. And with a fish, I mean, you're more likely to get paid off with those hands. So you could bifurcate your ranges in those situations. Bifurcate meaning just splitting, basically. Bi meaning to, furcate probably just means splitting. So two splits. Um, and those would be my recommendations for facing an RFI. And I'm gonna make I'm gonna end up making a Google Drive where I just have a bunch of ranges freely available. I haven't made it yet, but when I do make it, it'll probably be in the description. And yep, that's it. Thank you. Bye.